Thank you. And our final speaker for today, as she's a distinguished professor, we've let her show some pictures. Billie Giles Corti, who is the director of RMIT's Enabling Capability Platform, which to those of you who aren't at RMIT is basically the idea of how we do research together. And Billie's ECP is entitled Urban Futures. And Mark, if you can flip over to the other slide deck, that would be great. Thank you. And drop the house lights. Thank you.
So thank you. Jay asked me why I was a distinguished professor, and I said it was because I'm old, and I'm just proving that now because I'm using old-fashioned technology. Anyway, could a decentralised Victoria create a healthy, more livable Victoria? And I'm addressing that because actually I'm a public health academic, and I'm not a planner, I'm not a transport planner, I'm not an urban designer, I'm not an architect. And so in that sense, I'm quite unusual to be interested in this topic, but it's been something that's been a passion of mine and has driven my research for the last 20 years. And it's interesting looking at the possibilities. Now, we're all sort of a bit crestfallen because we've lost our mantle, and I think that's quite an interesting thing, and it's an opportunity for us to rethink about Melbourne. But it's really interesting when you look at this, the Economist Intelligence Unit's indicators. For example, under culture and environment, humidity and temperature rating, discomfort of climate to travellers are two of the indicators that are used to help give us the 25% in terms of the this particular part of the index. In terms of education, it's about availability of private education, the quality of private education. And in terms of stability, prevalence of crime, violent crime, threat of military conflict, threat of civil unrest. And in fact, Australia, compared to Vienna, was 5 points below Vienna in terms of this particular one of the major contributors to our loss of our mantle. I guess my point is that when we look to the Economist Intelligence Unit, it's really not that useful for the way we think about our cities, the way we think about our cities in terms of the rapid growth that we're going through, and the need for us to change the way we're designing our cities. Now, we've been thinking about this a lot in our team. We've done a study, a Creating Livable Cities study, which we've been measuring livability across Australia. And I'm only going to give you a snippet of what we've got for Victoria, for Melbourne actually, because we have a launch in a few weeks, and I don't want to spoil you not coming to the launch of our scorecard for Melbourne. But what we found was that all cities across the country, they seem to value the idea of walkability and livability, but to be honest, we don't have the policy frameworks in place to deliver it. And I'm going to show you just a little snippet of the results. We don't have measurable spatial standards, so telling us where we should be putting things in terms of local employment, housing, affordability. These are two things that are not even considered in our planning policies in terms of the spatial distribution. And we find that when we look across the country, there's really a lot of difference between the different cities, all the capital cities. Everyone has a different approach. They're not really evidence-based in terms of what would actually produce the outcomes that we're seeking, walkability, livability, and there's great variation in the degree of policy ambition. So in this country, we have a problem with the variation of policy, the lack of delivery of policy, and this is something that we really need to be thinking about when we're thinking about the livability of a city. Now, let me just show you in terms of Melbourne's walkability. Liz has referred to this, and we've heard that too from Pat, about a failure to deliver a better city. Now, it's a bit green. This, I think it must be the quality of the screen. But in the middle of Melbourne, you can see that it's a very walkable environment. We've got the traditional sorts of street grids we've got shops and services, we've got high levels of density, and as a result of that, this is a walkability map for Melbourne, and it's nice and green. But anything from yellow to red is where you would see no one walking. And you can see that, as we've heard from our other speakers, is that on the fringe of Melbourne, we're actually delivering a city that has been designed purposely for the car, and where we would see very little walking because we haven't designed it that way. Inner Melbourne's been designed for walking. When we look at transport policy, our policy in Victoria is that 95% of residents should live within 400 metres of a bus stop, 800 metres of a train stop and 600 metres of a tram stop. So this is our policy, and the target is 95%, which is terrific that we have that target. And what we see here on the map on the left is all the residential areas within each suburb, which is shaded according to the suburb average. So if you look over to the right, the legend there, anything that's sort of dark red or dark is really doing pretty well. Out on the fringe, you can see the lower colours and the lighter colours, and that's where we've got much less access to public transport, as you probably would expect, particularly when you look at the walkability. A lot of that's driven by the levels of density. And when we look at the suburbs that are actually achieving the target of 95%, we see it's only really in the inner city that we're achieving this target of 95% of residents as being within the close proximity to public transport. So we have policy, but we're not delivering it, and as a consequence of that, that's really affecting the true livability of our city, the lived experience of our city. And part of that, as we've seen referred to, is the idea of density. In our city, we have a big problem. We have at the top of there is the levels of density. So it shows the darker the colour, the more dense. So you can see in inner Melbourne, nice colours. We're getting up to, on average, around 26 to 30 dwellings per hectare, a little bit higher in the real central areas. But out on the fringe, we're seeing 5 to 10 dwellings per hectare, extremely low density. And then we look at what the policy target is, which is extraordinarily low in Melbourne, 15 dwellings per hectare, far too low to deliver a walkable, livable city. We see that the only suburbs that are really the green is where we're actually delivering that level of density is really mainly just on the fringe. So even with the policies that we've got in place, a modest 15 dwellings per hectare, we have none of that being delivered on the fringe. And so that really is affecting the livability of our city. So I guess I wanted to reflect on what this means then for Balanced Victoria and this idea that we'll be moving into developing greenfield sites, developments. I think for a start, one thing I'd like to argue is that the concept of livability is a really important one. I think it's something that we all value, but it needs to be centrally held. It needs to be the Premier or the Prime Minister needs to be holding this concept and asking everyone across the departments, the multi-sector departments, what they're doing to contribute to creating a livable future. Because often the policies of different departments are at cross purposes with each other to be able to deliver the concept. So when it sits in planning can draw the plan, but it can't populate the plan. It's other departments that will determine that. And that's why it's so important for this concept to be held centrally. And equally important when we're thinking about Balanced Victoria. We need to have integrated planning and regulatory framework that will create the level playing field for the private sector. And I think this is really critical. And when we talk about that, we've heard that it's really important to have integrated land use and transport planning, but in this regional communities, what's going to be critical for the success of those communities is also land use, transport and infrastructure planning. That needs to be planned up front, otherwise we'll end up, as we have on the fringe of our cities, low density environments without an adequate infrastructure. I haven't given you all the other infrastructure results because I'm teasing you for our launch in September. Looking to Europe, what can we learn? One of the things I've been looking at, what can we learn from Europe in terms of the way it has gone about and has delivered the more integrated planning, the higher density development that it has achieved. First of all, what we often see is vertical and horizontal planning. So vertical being all levels of government and horizontal across all the different departments. So rather than just one department deciding on the livability of a city, it would be all the departments that are integrated together, but also all levels of government, what goes on locally, at state and at federal, all contributing to the outcome. It's interesting looking at the compact cities policy of the mid-80s in the Netherlands. It mandated that the minimum densities were 37 dwellings per hectare. Now in 2018, in Australia, Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne, our policies still are at 15 dwellings per hectare. Extraordinarily low, and of course that's why we're getting the outcomes that we are. And I think it's really important when we're thinking of these regional cities or these that we actually also think about protecting our agricultural land, something that has been done from the mid-80s in the Netherlands. it's really important to put high density dwellings around public transport to make as many people as possible have access to the high quality public transport. And so as we build these cities, what can we do around those transport hubs if we're going for high speed rail to have the high density around that to make it worthwhile. The public transport needs to be delivered up front, which is obviously going to happen in this case because that will be the driver of the development of these new towns. The social infrastructure is not an afterthought. It has to be thought up front. What you see often in Europe is that the temporary facilities are provided so that the facilities are there right from the outcome and people don't have to wait. And I think that's going to be really important for this circumstance. We need to have a commitment to the green wedges in cities and to make sure that there's adequate public open space. The idea of mixed uses rather than mixed zoning. Mixed zoning was something that we've had for centuries now, but it's a problem because you have all the shops in one side, the separated of land uses, rather than the mixed uses, which is what we used to see in places like Fitzroy. There's lots of mixed uses, and so there's lots of places to walk to. We need to be designing to increase access to destination and access by foot. In Europe, you see 35% of trips are by foot, 40% are by bicycle. And what's interesting to me when I look at these from a health point of view, it's not just young people who are doing it. People in their 70s are still using cycling and cycling and walking as a way of getting around their city. Traffic management so that it makes the alternatives more attractive. Cycling infrastructure and bike parking around the train stations. You see that when you go to Europe, everyone's got access to a bike park and there's lots of safe cycle paths to the public transport. And then it's cutting the number of mandatory car bays. This is Liz's issue. And finally, when we're talking about apartment standards, having bike parking incorporated into those. I think unless we're thinking about all the things that are going to make the place work, then we'll actually run the risk of ending up with, there's lots of agricultural land, so let's just spread out. But I think what's going to make cities work in a way that we see they do as they do in Europe, where people are using alternatives, it's a much more healthy future, is if we're thinking about the legislative and the regulatory framework that we can put in place to create this level playing field. So thank you.